Dan Perry is the former Associate Press Chief Editor for Europe, Africa and the Middle East. He also joins us live from Tel Aviv. Thank you very much for joining us. Dan, why has there been protests on what has been a controversial decision that has been debated extensively in Israeli society for quite a while now?
Yeah, ever since its founding. Basically, the Haredi sect was once very, very tiny, but because of incredible birth rates of between 7 and 8 children per family, they have grown and currently account for about an eighth of Israel, are doubling as a proportion every 20 years. So, you know, in one generation, it'll be a quarter and eventually a majority. They refuse to serve in the army because of various religious notions and, frankly, political machinations. And whereas it was once tolerable for the majority of Israelis, some by acquiescence and others because they do respect the idea that Jewish seminary study has some value for Jewish life and maybe it should be preserved at the expense of all else. That's breaking down completely. And at this point, 70 to 80% of society wants an end to these draft exemptions. And so most of the protests is against the Haredim and against the government for seeming to be planning a law that would formalize the exemption. Until now, the exemption was an arrangement and not a law. The Supreme Court last June declared that that this cannot continue without a law. The government depends on Haredi parties to stay in power, and they're demanding such a law. This has genuine potential to bring down the coalition, because of all the possible issues in Israel in which there's disagreement between left and right. This is the only one where there is intensive disagreement within the right, because the rest of the right wing, the regular religious Jews, and the secular right-wing Jews hate this situation.
I was just going to say, I mean, what pressure is Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu facing? You're saying that this could potentially bring down a coalition that he relies on. He's been the longest-serving Israeli Prime Minister at a time when even war and the situation with the captives and the disagreements that were within the war cabinet haven't been able to break this coalition.
That's absolutely true, because the coalition has stayed together despite Netanyahu's corruption scandals, despite the dissatisfaction with the war, despite the anger over the so-called judicial reforms, which are really an effort to Putinize the country, despite the failures of October 7th. It's been remarkably resilient, largely because all the elements of the coalition know that if they should, for any reason, fall apart and cause new elections, they will probably lose those elections. But this issue is truly visceral, and it's because of the war. The army currently is stating very clearly that they need tens of thousands of new soldiers to continue the war, even as the army suggests that the war could have ended long ago and is being prolonged for political reasons. So it's quite a mess. Regular Israelis have to serve 70, 80, 90, sometimes 200 days of reserve duty a year. Meanwhile, 80,000 draft-age Haredi men are sitting around in seminaries studying Jewish texts. Sometimes it's a fiction.
I wanted to also ask you, aside from this topic, how are Israelis reacting to the US president-elect, especially when he says that all hell will break loose? How has that been received by the families of those held captive that are absolutely desperate to bring them back home, whether they are alive or not?
Well, Trump is not a person who speaks with great precision and oftentimes without much coherence. But it's very, very clear that he identifies that Biden somehow allowed the war to go on longer than the vast majority of people in the region and in America would like to have seen. And that includes Israelis. The vast majority of Israelis want somehow for this war to end. Now, what he means by saying there's going to be hell to pay is obviously not at all clear, and what leverage he might have on the various sides is also a very open question. He does have leverage on Netanyahu, clearly, but they could go in several different ways. One way would be to force him to accept Hamas's terms of an end to the war with Hamas remaining in power in Gaza. Very few Israelis want that. I doubt Trump wants that. Another thing he could do is force Netanyahu to agree to create a logical endgame, meaning allowing the Palestinian Authority or some version of it to take over for Hamas. Netanyahu has blocked this because elements of his coalition oppose it. So Israel has great strategic fuzziness, and Trump could potentially force them to rethink that. But it's also possible that Trump could apply great pressure on Arab countries to maximize the pressure on Hamas, essentially to do what almost any human and a rational force would have done at this point,
And
which
of
is to
course, let's
surrender.
not forget that Donald Trump.
If Gaza has been so devastated.
And of course, let's not forget that Donald Trump, previously as president, was the architect of normalization of relations in the region. Dan Perry, thank you very much for your input. We'll have to leave it there. The former associate press chief editor for Europe, Africa and the Middle East. For more on this, we speak to Dan Perry, who's a former associate press chief editor for Europe, Africa and Middle East, and he joins us live from Tel Aviv. Dan, please explain to us exactly why this has been one of the most contentious disputes, across Israel, and why this is very much divisive.
Well, the Haredi community used to be very small, but because of tremendous birth rates of around 7 children per family or more, they've grown to be about an eighth of Israel, and they double in proportion every couple of years, every 20 years. And basically, currently, they account for something approaching a quarter of all potential draft-age Jewish men. And there's been an arrangement since the founding of the country that if they go to yeshiva seminaries, then they don't have to serve. But it's becoming untenable, both because their numbers are growing too much, and also because of the current conflict, that the military needs more soldiers. And that fact has been exposed in the reality where some Israeli secular reservists serve up to 200 days a year reserve duty in Gaza and elsewhere, and that's obviously unsustainable and absurd. You add to this the fact that this community doesn't participate very much in the labor force, that they require essentially subsidies for most of their life and for the Torah study. It's coming to a head in Israel. And the political drama is that the right wing in Israel has never had a majority without Haredi political parties. And so they depend on those parties. Netanyahu depends on those parties. So it's a wedge issue within the right, because the other two elements of the right wing in Israel, Netanyahu's coalition, are non-Haredi religious Jews in their parties and secular right-wing Jews, mostly. And those last two groups very much serve in the army, are very much paying the price of this war, and they're becoming increasingly angry at the Haredim who insist on this draft exemption. Now, it's been an arrangement, as I said. The Supreme Court, on the basis of equality under the law last June, established that they cannot continue without legislation. That legislation, the Haredi parties demand, should enshrine this exemption, and the rest of Israeli society despises it. Polls show approaching 80% of the people don't want it. So Netanyahu's in a pickle, because if he doesn't give the Haredim what they want, his government might collapse. If he does give the Haredim what they want, half or more of his own coalition will hate it. And, the vast majority of Israelis will be livid at him. So clearly, this is a major political conundrum for the government.
OK, thanks very much, Dan Perry. We'll have to leave it there. Former AP chief editor.